You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, the show where archaeology and technology collide and create something awesome. This is episode 62, and I'm your host, Chris Webster, with my co-host, Paul Zimmerman. On today's show, we talk about using tech without internet. It's a scary world when that happens, but listen to this and it'll be okay. Let's get to it. Okay, welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast, everyone, and welcome again, Paul.
Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Good. So, as I can't remember, even though I just edited this episode the other day as we recorded this, I can't remember if we talked about it or not, but we had a bunch of topics that we're going to talk about over the fall here, and one that I think is really good to start off with is something that, as a person who uses technology a lot and promotes technology a lot in archaeology, especially cultural resource management archaeology, I'm constantly bombarded with the question, what do I do with, first off, honestly, the biggest question is what do I do without power? Because things fail, batteries die. But that's just... Yeah,
we discussed that a little, I think.
Yeah, a little bit. And we actually did a whole show on batteries like a couple of years ago on Archaeotech Podcast. And batteries are batteries. They're going to get better. So, you have to have good power management, but also bring extra power with you and figure out ways to do that. That's not that hard of a problem to solve. The other biggest thing that I get is what do you do without internet? So, because a lot of people think, and sometimes this is true for certain things, but a lot of people think that you need internet access on a lot of these applications for them to operate properly. And in some cases, in some applications, that is true. My only answer to that would be don't use those applications, find better ones. And we'll talk about that. But let's talk about life in when you didn't have a choice to have no internet, like, the pre-internet world. I didn't really work in archaeology when it was, I guess I did. Yeah, I did, because I started in about 2005, and smartphones weren't really a thing. They were just becoming a thing, because I think the iPhone came out in, what was it? Oh, it was a little later than that, I guess. But either way, internet wasn't expected to be in the field. You could have it if you were doing some sort of weird networking thing, stuff like that. But generally, you didn't have internet. It's really only been in, I would say, the last maybe 10 years, but less than that, that internet has been becoming more ubiquitous through the use of smartphones. And then about 5 years ago, through connected tablets, and you've always had other little things you can do to get internet access. But let's talk about some pre-internet stuff. So, Paul, we kind of talked about on the last episode when we were introducing you some of the work you did back in, I guess, the late 90s, early 2000s when you were working. What were you guys' expectations for what you could do in the field, and what would you have liked to have seen in the field?
Well, it was really it was a time of a lot of change. I mean, when I started working in Masca in '93, our internet was a coax cable that connected a LAN, and we had certain sites on Gopher and Usenet and FTP sites, and that was pretty much it. And then the web came, and that was a quantum leap. I mean, that was a huge change, and we all saw a lot of potential there. As we were going in the field, we typically didn't have any kind of internet access, and it would just drive us batty because we were still doing things with faxes, for example. And those of us who were relatively internet savvy were like, well, why don't we just send these documents via email? But typically getting email involved, going and finding the closest hotel that, luxury hotel that had a business center that we could use, pay exorbitant rates for dial-up. Mm-hmm. Things got better, as the internet became better in so many ways through the 90s into the early 2000s. But the last time I was in the field was 2004. And even then, this was before the smartphone revolution. Things weren't to the point that they are now. So it was always in the back of our mind while we were working that the internet was going to become more accessible. We're going to be able to use the internet in the lab at a minimum. And then maybe if we're really lucky, someday there'll be devices that we could actually use in the field for our data collection and sync everything up or do research and such. I don't think that we had the real outlines of it in mind like we do now, where you have a question, you hop on Google or Wikipedia, or communication with family back home. All these things is so much easier than it used to be. But we knew where it was going. We just weren't there yet. The last time I was active, and so now this is over 10 years since, and the expectation, at least for all of us city dwellers, is that you have internet all the time, anywhere you go.
Right.
But I know that can't be the fact of the matter in the field, and so I want to talk to you to find out what it's like being an active archaeologist in the field with your expectations about the internet or lack thereof.
Well, I'll tell you what, it definitely can become a crutch if you don't know how to operate without it, because you're right. I mean, I live in Reno, but even so, here, just about everywhere, you have pretty decent cell phone service, but there's a bunch of hills and things like that, and all the towers are up on the mountains and stuff. So, and then some scattered throughout the city, but there's still certain circumstances where you don't get internet. But I mean, 15 minutes to the east of me, you could have zero internet and zero cell service because you're solidly in BLM land over the other side of a mountain range where there's no towers. So it's a real concern here in Nevada, and then especially all the mountainous and desert regions. There just isn't that kind of coverage for the cell towers. Now, of course, there's always satellite internet, which has never really come down in price for people to be able to use the way that we use the cellular internet.
Yeah, satellite internet was always what we kept our eyes on. We looked at all these sat phones and things and thought, I know, if only we could afford that, we could really do so much more.
Well, and that's the crazy thing about satellite. We're still thinking that. Like, everybody still thinks, if only I could afford that, because it's still ridiculously expensive. It's a weird market that is awesome, but never took off and never got enough competition to bring the prices down. So, I think I don't know who's controlling that. I don't know what the reasons for that are. I mean, I know satellites are expensive to put up, but if Sirius and XM radio can manage to get a whole bunch of satellites in the air just for music and talk, you think we could get some satellites up for communications. So, but anyway, I did a project that I've talked about quite a bit on this show and some other shows that was down in the Eastern Mojave Desert a couple of years ago. And not only was it in the Mojave Desert, and I say Eastern Mojave because Eastern Mojave is a little more mountainous. It's not like desert like you would think of. It's actually kind of the limits of the Great Basin in that it's a higher altitude, and there's actually some vegetation. It's not all just sand and stuff. But that being said, it was also on an ultra-secure military installation. So while we did have cell service on part of the base, the back kind of part of the base, way far to the east, we had nothing. No cell service, no internet, no nothing. And we weren't even supposed to use our phones technically on the part of the base where we did have cell service that was kind of closer to town. We all kind of did, and plus most of my tablets were connected anyway, so you didn't have to like pull out your phone, but the tablet was connected online through a cell network. But I guess I never really expected to have internet, which was kind of my expectation. I was like, we need to be able to do everything we can without it. However, if we do have it, we're going to use it. We're going to do certain things, whether that's looking things up. Although I didn't really need to do that either, because like I said, I plan to not have internet. So all of my tablets have a complete set of references on there for everything we could possibly need. Most things that we could possibly need, I should say, not everything. So all the PDFs and some PDF copies of books and things like that, that's all searchable. Every single tablet had one of those reference libraries on it that you could easily access.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, the only thing we really couldn't do, which I always like to do, is backup data off-site. Now, I carried around... each one of my crew chiefs had this little, looks like a little USB stick. It's the SanDisk Wi-Fi Connect, which I've talked about before on this show. That just creates its own little Wi-Fi network. You don't have to plug it in through USB onto the tablet, because the tablet doesn't have, iPads don't have a USB connector. So you just connect it through Wi-Fi, and then you back up your data to the SanDisk app on the tablet, and then connect that tablet to the Wi-Fi network created by the SanDisk drive, and then transfer via the SanDisk app to the drive. So now you're at least backed up in a location off the tablet, but it's still not off-site. So worst case scenario, there's a fiery car crash and everybody dies, and you burn up all your tablets and your drives, and you've lost all your data. More importantly than everybody dying, you've lost all your data. So spoken as a true company owner there.
Yeah.
But so yeah, we planned for not having connectivity, and like I said about the Wi-Fi USB drives, those are pretty cool, and there's lots of different kinds out there. But the one other way that we actually did backups in the field, and I want to talk about that in a second too, the uses for the internet. But anyway, one of the things we did for backups in the field was we actually used an application, Tapforms, which I've talked about extensively, that allows you to, in their terminology, beam forms from one to the other. I think the guy was probably a Star Trek fan, not really sure. But anyway, we beam information from one to the other. That wasn't as efficient because you couldn't like beam batches of data. You could beam records of data. And if you just got one like record, that's fine. But if you just sat there and recorded 65 tin cans and those are all each a separate record or something like that, you got to do them separately. And that's tedious, but if for some reason all your other methods died for sharing and syncing your data.
Still better than nothing.
Still better than nothing, right? I would rather the information was on two tablets rather than one, because you don't send the data and then it gets destroyed on your own tablet. You still keep your own data, so at least it's in two different places. So so we did do that, and I tried to do that at the end of every site recording, not the beaming, but at least the syncing of data to the Wi-Fi card, to the Wi-Fi USB drive. And then more often than not, if I had time, I would take the data from that USB drive and then sync it back to my tablet and bring those forms in. Usually because I was always the crew chief and I would, on those crews, and then I'd be writing up the site record and I would need the data anyway. So I would do that. But that's one of the things, I wanted to, because you were kind of alluding to your expectations of that, of have what you could do with the internet in the field. That's one of the things I wanted to try to bring up, because how have our expectations changed? Because I think the way people think they want to use the internet in the field has changed dramatically as we've had more internet in the field. Back in the day, you guys mentioned trying to get to the hotel and check email and do things like that, and then maybe, do a sync and backup, with the home computers or something. But I'm not sure that people are even really concerned. Like checking email and stuff like that is just something we know we're going to be able to do when we get back from the field, unless you're camping and you're out in the middle of nowhere. So email is not really a concern, at least to most people I know, because it's almost a guaranteed thing. At some point during your day, you'll have access to email. And then backing up of data is a really big concern, and that's usually the best way to do that is online through a cloud server, FTP server, something like that, something you can just get off device. But what do you think some of the other expectations are for what we should be able to do with the internet? Like, have this same conversation now for 10 years from now that you guys were having, when you were in the field, with your expectations of what you can be doing. What do we think we can do in, 10 years? I don't know.
Well, a big part of what we were thinking about always was live access to each other's data. So, you've got your crew out there and they're each working with their own tablets, and they can sync it up with this USB drive, or they can sync it up by getting on ad hoc networks and send things back and forth to each other. But we always thought that it'd be really cool to have a centralized database for everybody's work on a particular project at all times and automatically updated. So you'd go out there into the field, you would record whatever you're doing in your trench, somebody else is recording what they're doing in their trench. The crew chief can see what's going on in everybody's trenches all at once. You guys can, everybody can have a kind of global sense. You find something that you don't quite know what it is, or you think it's interesting, you could quickly look across other trenches without having to get up and walk over the site to see if there's something else there that's analogous. And then also, research tool. I already said that. You said that you load up a lot of research materials anyhow onto the tablets, which is still way, way ahead of what we could do back then. I mean, we were still dealing with floppies most of the time. Maybe we'd go out with a stack of CDs toward the end of that. But that's still way, way clunkier than just having a bunch of reference materials preloaded onto the tablets that every crew member has. So it's I maybe I lack the vision, but I don't see a really whiz bang single technology that would totally change everything, so much as just everything getting better, more secure in terms of data backup, and easier to do one's research, whether that's looking up something quickly in the field or, doing the big statistical kind of analyses across, full data sets. All of that becomes easier if you can offload at least parts of it, across a good network, and the best network we've got would be the internet.
That's a good conversation to have, because it's interesting you mentioned being able to see each other's data in real time, because it's good to get the terminology down for people listening to this that might not be aware, because to me, that doesn't actually even take, the internet. It would be easier if you had some sort of, cloud server that everything was going up to and then back down from. But that being said, there's plenty of ways to create just a local area mesh network these days where all the devices are connected to each other. Maybe there's a central processing device that's creating that, or maybe it's in each one of the devices. There's a couple things coming online these days. Beartooth is one of them that's like a local communications mesh network that can actually send text and data message back and forth to each one of its devices. Not really good for what we need to do right now, but really close, really close. And but I guess some of the things I always think of, especially as a project manager and a company owner and somebody who's trying to get projects done in a most efficient way possible, is when I think of, let's say, internet use in the field, I'm thinking, what are things that I'm doing, let's say, back in the office with my data that I could be doing in real time? And some of those things are site records. Like when we finish recording a site, I'd love to have a team of people sitting in the office. And the minute we finish recording a site, they have all the data, and probably by the time we start work the next morning, they've got the site records done for the previous day. And if we need to make changes later on, changes can be made easily, but usually we don't. If we need to combine sites, that can also be done easily. But most of the time, that's not really an issue. But
expanded on the idea of having real-time network sharing the data across everybody in the trench. Any of the big projects that I worked on, we'd have people back in the dig house all day doing whatever they were doing, registrars, ceramicists, and so on. Usually too far away for any kind of local network to be practical.
That's true.
Which is where the internet would come in. We could have everybody synced up to the same data store somewhere out in the cloud, and people collecting data, in the field and in the lab, and analyzing data in the field and in the lab concurrently. While you have different parts of the team in different locations.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
And you could expand that, globally too, for specialists who don't even come out into the field with you.
Absolutely, man. I have thought about that so much. And we're going to go to break here in a second, but I just got to say, one of my dreams, and it's been ever since probably 5 years ago now. I took a picture of a bottle base on a site because we weren't sure, and I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again. But we weren't sure what the site dated to because there wasn't anything really obvious on there, and I found this one maker's mark on a bottle base, and I didn't recognize it. And I didn't have I was working for another company, so I didn't have my digital reference library with me that I usually do now. And so I took a picture of it and I put it on Twitter. And I was like, hey, does anybody know what this is? #Archaeology. And within minutes, I had not only several corroborating responses that said what it was, but I also had a reference for the book that they found it in. And and I had a date range for it, so we went ahead and recorded that site. And because it fell within the range that we were recording. And if it had been just outside, like a little too new, and we weren't supposed to record it, we could have wasted 2 hours. And there was 4 of us, and if it would have taken, it did take us a couple hours to record that site. And with a project manager and 3 field technicians billing out at $60 to $120 an hour for 2 hours, that saved us a lot of money. That simple tweet. And I've really thought, especially with specialists, being accessible and all over the place, if we could just take a really quick either 3D scan or do a real quick photogrammetry sequence across a projectile point or another artifact or a feature even, and then quickly process that on your mobile device and then send that off into the internet to somebody else, and they could even throw their 3D goggles or their HoloLens on and then take a look at this thing and hold it and look at it in real time, or even print one out. Hell, if you can get a high quality enough scan, they could print one out and then tell you everything about it, and they're on the other side of the planet, So let's take a break real quick because we've had some. You guys couldn't hear this, but we had some technical issues with the fire alarm, and I don't know what time we're looking at right now. The stopwatch is all over the place. So we're going to take a break, and we'll come back for our second segment and continue talking about the scary, scary internetless world out there in the field.
This network is supported by our listeners. You can become a supporting member by going to arcpodnet.com/members and signing up. As a supporting member, you have access to high-quality downloads of each show and a discount at our future online store, and access to show hosts on a members-only Slack team. For professional members, we'll have training shows and other special content offered throughout the year. Once again, go to arcpodnet.com/members to support the network and get some great extras and swag in the process. That's arcpodnet.com/members.
Hi, welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast. This is Paul. Today, Chris and I are discussing using tech without the internet. Now, Chris, one of the things that I've been thinking about the internet use is, obviously we use it for communication very heavily. We don't just use it for research and, talking to researchers, colleagues halfway around the world, but we use it day to day for a lot of, for keeping track with people, keeping track of friends and family, other colleagues, whatever. And that's been really, in a lot of ways, where the internet has had its greatest impact, I think. We're used to using the internet a lot, texting, I don't know about you, but I'm texting with my family members all the time. My kids, we're keeping track of each other. Where are you? Whose house are you at? Where are you going after this? Excuse me. It's become a real convenience for safety, I guess. Knowing what we're up to, making plans, arranging, meeting up with people. And, I think that this has become the standard, how people are interacting with each other in a lot of ways, in a lot of parts of our lives. So I was wondering, when you're in the field, since most of your workers probably have the expectation that they have, that they can text each other or, tweet each other, or they're on Facebook, or they can call each other or whatever. What happens when you're in the field and you don't have that internet access? Does that pose any particular safety concerns or challenges that you have to meet?
Yes, it does. And I think to go back to that project again on the military base a couple years ago, that was one of the most challenging situations I ever had for safety and communications, because it took us, on one of those parts of the base where we spent probably several months total, we had to keep, we'd go out for a couple of days and go to another place, and they kept moving us around because they were bombing in different areas, and they'd tell us that only in the morning, that we wouldn't get the schedule ahead of time. So
we don't get the fire alarm schedule here, so I'm not surprised.
Exactly. So we were out in this remote area of the base, and it took us an hour and a half to 2 hours at a pretty high clip in a 4-wheel drive vehicle over a 2-track road to get out to some of these areas. And now out in these areas, you have unexploded ordnance, you have rattlesnakes, you have rocks to twist an ankle on, you have all kinds of stuff. And the only communication we had, again, no cell service. We weren't allowed to use radios. We were always in visual sight of each other. We were never out of, because it was a really flat kind of area with no trees. There was plenty of sagebrush and stuff, but not obscuring vision. So we couldn't use radios because, scary enough, radio frequencies, even the handheld radio types, if they weren't approved by the base, they weren't allowed, and they didn't approve anything that they basically didn't issue us. So because apparently certain experimental weapons and things like that in bombs could be set off, actually activated by those radio frequencies, or so they said. Yeah, so we had an unexploded ordnance technician with us at all times, and he had a radio that was issued by the base that could hit their repeater network, which was the only communication system out there. So if that radio failed for some reason, we actually had to go back because there was zero communication with the base at that point. But even then, they told us that if somebody got bit by a rattlesnake or was in dire circumstances, they don't have a helo sitting at the ready to come get us. They have to call the crew. They made it sound like it was a real chore. They had to call the crew, get them in there, pre-flight the bird, and then get out there and then fly us to the hospital. And they're like, and we're not flying you to a military hospital, we're flying you to the hospital in town. So deal with it. And so, yeah, safety was a huge concern for us. However, again, this comes down to planning. I knew that was going to happen. So I actually had apps on my phone and some on the tablets that were like medical, plus I have first aid training, which also helped. But I had, the medical first aid type applications. But again, this is where it comes down to planning. There's a lot of them out there that you don't even realize are like HTML5 apps, which means they're an app, but they're basically a glorified web browser. There's no data. Mm-hmm. If you download an app and it's ready to use within seconds, it's accessing all of its data on the web. If it takes, several minutes on a good Wi-Fi network to download, then it's downloading a whole bunch of data to your phone. And that's what you want for being in the field. And that's what you have to think of when you think of what size of tablet you're going to buy and stuff like that. How much data do you need on board the tablet versus how much can you access remotely through the internet? But if you're not going to have internet like we did, I wanted everything that we would possibly need with us at all times. I even had an extra tablet in each truck in case one of the tablets went down for some reason. They never did because iPads are pretty robust, but it was always there in case we needed it. So again, I think the name of the game for this podcast is going to be planning. It shouldn't be a surprise that you're not going to have internet.
Right. So you plan and you prepare for the eventuality, the expectation that you're not going to have it. What about crew members? Do you have people that ever balk maybe at the notion of being out and away from everything?
I actually, on that project, I had to actually call the hospital in town and make sure they had rattlesnake antidote at the ready and in stock, because they heard something from some person in a bar when they first got there that, this hospital doesn't even carry the antivenom for rattlesnake. And I called them, and the nurses apparently heard that story before. And she's like, no, we have it. We have a lot of it. Just come in. We'll give it to you. We'll even meet you somewhere in an ambulance with it if we know it's a rattlesnake bite, because that's what these guys were really afraid of. And and I had a couple guys that were, I think the desire for a paycheck was outweighing their desire to not have a paycheck. So they were still out there, but it was a really close balance between, I don't know if I want to be here or not, unless I'm assured of my safety out in the field, because that was the huge concern. Especially, it's weird because you get over the bombs really fast. You know what they look like, even though a lot of them were kind of half buried, and I don't know how many of these little cluster bomb things I kind of stepped on. Most of them are inert, but like 1 in every 50 is not. That's how they track them when they drop the test ones. And but you kind of get over that real quick, and I don't know why, because they're more visible. But rattlesnakes scare the crap out of you, no matter how many you've seen that day. We had some times where we saw 5, 6 in a day, and it was like every single time, it's the most terrifying thing you've ever seen. So, so we had to have those fears. I wish we could have had some like rattlesnake venom with us, but it's not the kind of thing you're supposed to administer yourself. But yeah, so those were big safety concerns, and part of that was lack of communication, because if the one radio happened to go down, or for some reason we were in an area where the communication with the repeater wasn't so good, which there were some areas where it wasn't the best communication. We weren't supposed to be out there at all in any area if we couldn't hear radio chatter. We had some times where our unexploded ordnance technician said, okay, everybody back in the trucks, we have to go back where we can communicate, because if for some reason we didn't get the schedule or somebody changed it and they decided they were going to bomb that area, they call first and say, hey, is anybody out there? And if nobody answers, they bomb it. So, it was a pretty big concern. So yeah, again, planning. That's we knew that was going to be the case. We had a meeting with the base prior to starting field work, about a week prior, and I also knew from talking to other people the lack of communication that was going to happen in that base. So we planned as much as we could for it, and ultimately it worked out really well. And the base archaeologist said we did one of the most efficient projects they'd ever seen out there. So because of the way we ran it, but that's all about planning.
Planning.
Yeah, totally.
Were you a Boy Scout?
I was not, but you
be prepared.
You become one pretty quick when you're in charge of the budget and the financials. Oh man, because that's the other thing planning does for you, is it helps you. I don't want to say save money. I guess save money, but really just operate at a more efficient level. And if you're not doing that, you're just bleeding cash. So. It's funny how doing all these things from a project management standpoint, they have a bunch of unanticipated effects. So if I go out there and I plan for data backup, and I plan for safety, and I plan for security and all these things, that's just going to inherently save me money because everything's going to be more efficient as a result, So if we've got all our references and things like that in the field and all our data backed up in the field, then we don't lose any data, which means we don't have to. I've been on projects with other companies where we've had to go back out to sites because somebody lost those paper site forms. So they're gone. Yeah. Nothing left. We have to go back out and re-record this thing. And that could be out here in Nevada. That could be a big ordeal. You could have a 4-hour drive and a 2-hour hike just to get into a site to record for 30 minutes and then come back. And that was a long, long day. So, it's, I don't know. It's crazy. But all this being said, I think this question, if somebody listens back to this podcast in 5 years, they're going to be like, what are they talking about without internet? Internet's everywhere.
Well, I think so.
Yeah, it's going really fast.
I mean, if we think just, with our cell phones, there were smartphones before 2007, before the iPhone, but now everybody, regardless of what platform they're on, is used to being tethered to this slab of glass that has, it's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? It's got everything that you could possibly want on it. But again, it's raised the expectations to a certain level that we can't always meet out in the field. So it seems like it's not terribly different than it was when I was active.
Right.
The access that you can get when you get it is so much better, but when you're without it, you still are stuck. You've got to have considered that beforehand.
Yeah, I've been using a lot of data lately for some reason. I don't know what I did to change in the last couple of months, but I'm on a new plan with AT&T where after we hit our 16 gigs of data for the month, my wife and I share a plan. Plus, I've got another tablet on the plan, so there's 3 devices on this plan. And once we hit that, they don't charge us anymore, but they throttle you. So it may as well be no internet. At least you're not getting charged more. But once they throttle your speed, I mean, you may as well be back in, 1985.
Useless speeds.
Right. I'm like 2400 baud dial-up at that point, and just remembering what that was like. But the thing that I'm really worried about, as far as field work goes, is it looks to me like in some of these rural areas, especially Nevada, a lot of the western states, and then in other parts of the world, actually. It seems to me like they're not putting up towers at a very high rate. And I'm not sure what that reason is. I mean, obviously population is a problem. If there's nobody that lives out there, then AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, whoever, they're not going to put a tower up out there. So you could almost never expect to find internet in some of those areas unless they change the technology. Like the existing towers they do have a wider range. That's one thing. But 2 things I'm worried about that are happening right now simultaneously. One is, and I put this in our notes here, drones and balloons. So Facebook has their internet drones and Google has their internet balloons called Project Loon. And they're trying them in other countries. They're not really trying them here yet because we generally consider ourselves as having internet most of the time. But there's countries out there where even in the big cities, not everybody has access to internet. So and this is, of course, a business interest for these groups. The more people they can get online, the more people they can see their ads, the more money they can get from their advertisers. So, but I don't mind it. If that's their business model and it gives the whole planet internet, fantastic. I'm all for that.
Yeah, and they've been pushing those, especially for areas that are totally underserved, parts of Africa and such.
Absolutely.
So they always try to spin a humanitarian bent to what they're doing, to what the projects are.
Yeah. Well, the thing that worried me about this was the growing popularity of things like the Chromebooks and stuff like that, the almost internet-only devices where they don't really have a hard drive. And again, like you said, city dwellers, man, like San Francisco and down in that area, Silicon Valley and New York City and Los Angeles, where all these things are being developed, these people have internet every single step of the way. Like they always have solid, really good internet no matter where they're at. So they're coming up with these ideas for devices that have little memory in them, which saves on the battery. So now you've got a way longer battery life because you're not spinning a hard drive up inside. You're not saving all this stuff. So to them, it sounds like a really good idea. And it makes me think as phones start to get thinner, as I've got the Apple Watch 2, the Apple Watch 3 will probably be announced a week from today. It might be announced a little later in the fall, but they might announce it at the iPhone event. That's rumored to be a device that can stand alone, which means it's going to have a cellular data chip inside of it. But it's still got a really tiny hard drive. So they're counting on internet access to run most of your things. And as the tech manufacturers start counting on more internet access and reducing your onboard data storage because they expect you to have internet, if we don't have that expectation of internet actually develop on pace with lack of hard drive space, a purposeful lack of hard drive space, then we're screwed out in the field. I'm about ready to buy like 40 iPads just so I can have them for when we confronted with that situation and can't buy them anymore.
I did see some device a couple years ago. I think it was on Indiegogo. It was really cool. I didn't save it though, and I haven't been able to find it since. Mm-hmm. But it basically was a hotspot. It was a big brick with a motorcycle battery in it, router that would automatically try to connect any way it could, Wi-Fi, cellular. I think it may have had a sat radio in it too. Nice. And it was meant for things like schools and remote areas or for disaster recovery. I'm guessing nothing ever came of it because, again, I haven't been able to find it ever since. Yeah. But, we may be stuck having to use stuff like that.
Yeah,
I'm sure that this one project wasn't the only one to come up with the same sort of idea. Mm-hmm. And again, I mentioned Raspberry Pis. I think that they had a Raspberry Pi as the guts of it.
Yeah,
I mentioned Raspberry Pis last episode.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think the mesh network thing is going to be, honestly, regardless of where technology goes and where things happen, I think we're going to be utilizing mesh networks more and more in the field because we're always together. We're rarely out as a lone wolf somewhere. We're always either in an excavation situation with a bunch of people, or we're even on survey out in the desert. We're only 30 meters apart from each other, and that's not unrealistic to think that somebody could be connecting that far. And if I can connect to the person next to me, because it's a mesh network, I'm connecting to the person that's 120 meters away from me as well, because they're all in a line. So,
right. Well, as it is right now, you can share your contact information, or airdrop a file across to somebody else, and it'll connect up with Wi-Fi if it can. It'll connect up with Bluetooth if it can. And I think that the balloons, the drones, the hotspots, all these things are just pointing that there are going to be a million different ways in the future to get online, and there are going to be different ones in different parts of the world. But there's going to be a push towards every way possible, any way possible at all times, just to make sure everybody can have that downtown San Francisco experience there. So.
Yeah, right. And I have to acknowledge, in case there's any real curmudgeons out there for technology actually listening to the Archaeotech podcast, which thank you, by the way, if you are, because, we aim to educate. However, I have to mention, the one thing we can always fall back on, Paul, that we didn't even mention in case all this fails, is we can't just pull out a notebook and a pen and write stuff down. So that's...
And then spend hours and hours and hours transcribing that into our database when we get back home, right?
Oh my God, yeah. So that's another
the old days.
That's an interesting thought experiment, because we do have optical character recognition, OCR, and things like that. But when you take somebody's handwritten field notes and on what's inevitably a dirty piece of paper or a notebook, because they always end up muddy, or something like that. They always end up dirty in some way.
Right.
And then
they're tired and full of adrenaline, and their handwriting's shaky.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, and you're either your handwriting in the morning, you're either still drunk from the night before, so you can't write very well, or you're dehydrated by the end of the day and you still can't write very well. So, or you're left-handed like me and you just can't write very well ever, which is really the impetus behind my whole technology push, is I'm left-handed. But it's amazing. It's an interesting thought experiment to wonder for archaeology, because none of that scanning technology and character recognition for handwriting really got to the point where it was effortless, where I could just scan a page and it just fills in everything perfectly, and I don't have to look at it, where the success rate is well over 95%. Because if it's not there, it's just as much work for me to type the damn thing in. If I've got to do a whole bunch of work on cleanup and formatting, OCR is a piece of junk to me if that's the case. If I want it to be in a digital form, what I want is to be able to scan a piece of paper that has handwritten notes on it and have that populate my form or Word document or whatever it is exactly without me having to touch it. And right now, the only way to really do that is to create that data digitally in the field on your tablet to begin with.
Yeah, I've never had any real success with OCR of my handwriting either.
But where would we be if that technology had actually progressed to that level? Would we still be preferring paper in the field generally because, it makes me wonder because we're trying to use tablets and figure out the best way to use that. But if that had been a technology that works at a 95% success rate or more, hell, I probably would have been using it. Why not? If it still means I don't have to type anything up, then that's really all we're looking for here. As long as it goes into a database, because that's the other thing is creating data, not just words on a page. So,
right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we did go a little long on this segment, but that's okay because I think the next one's going to be somewhat shorter than normal. So, let's tidy up this discussion on, and you guys can stop worrying now that you can go back to your internet. You can stop listening to the podcast and, open your phones up and stuff like that. And because the app of the day segment is coming right up. But we don't want you to have a panic attack, especially if you're under the age of 25, thinking about life without internet. So anyway, that's it for segment 2. Stick around just for 30 seconds or so, and we'll be right back with the app of the day segment. Hey, podcast fans, check out the ARC365 podcast at www.arcpodnet.com/ARC365. That's ARCH365 for your daily dose of archaeology. Each episode is less than 15 minutes long, and we have some great guests recording about awesome archaeology. We also try to throw in some definitions and basic archaeological information. So, check out the 365 Days of Archaeology podcast only in 2017 at www.arcpodnet.com/ARC365 today. Find us also on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and Google Music by typing ARC365 into the search. Now back to the show. All right, we're back with Archaeotech episode 62, and the whole episode was about tech without internet. However, we're going back to internet. Actually, I think at least my app can work without internet, the one I'm going to talk about. And that, surprisingly enough, is Apple's Numbers. Okay, and Numbers is what Apple calls their spreadsheet. It's like Excel. So the reason I'm talking about this is because I actually haven't used it in kind of a while because I've been just using Google Sheets for a lot of stuff online. But I had something I wanted to create. We had like an extra iPad mini laying around the house, and I kind of put it up in our bathroom next to our scale so we could record some stuff on there. And I wanted to create a document that we could use on that consistently. And Numbers was the first thing that sprang to my head because the iOS version of Numbers has a unique feature that the desktop version does not. So if you have an Apple computer, it won't be able to do this. But if you have Numbers on your iPhone or your iPad, then you will be able to do this. So basically, first off, they've made dramatic improvements on this thing. It used to be pretty featureless. Like it would do basic formulas and stuff, but they've added a lot of improvements to the mobile platform for Numbers. Even the desktop version never was as fully featured as Excel. I hate to admit that, but Excel's been around for like 40 years, so that's hard to compete with. But and I think Apple just recognized the fact that everybody's using Excel. They're not going to convert too many people over to Numbers. However, I love it because it's so fluid and easy to use. If I would say probably 60 to 70% of like spreadsheet projects people want to do, if they have Numbers available to them, they could and probably should use that. Unless they have to collaborate with other people, there can be some problems with formulas when you export into Excel, and with formatting, of course, like anything. But if you don't plan on exporting, it's something you just want to use, the Numbers is actually a really good solution. And one of the things, like I said, that I wanted to really talk about and focus on for the mobile applications is a really good quick thing you could use in the field for data entry if you're just entering data into a spreadsheet. Now, first thing you have to do is create your table. You create your table with your headers across the top and then whatever you want down across the side. And you click the little plus button up there like you're going to create a new sheet, but you create a new form instead. And then it'll ask you, based on the available tables, which table you want to use to make that form. You create this new form, and it's basically just a data entry form that it just automatically created based on the headers for the columns in your table. And every time you get down to the end of your form and you hit the little plus button, it'll create a new row in your table. So it's just a really fast way to create a data entry device. Now, I use Tapforms a lot in the field, which is basically a database program, but it's actually it's actually time consuming a little bit to make a really quick data entry form in tap forms. It's, you have to move some things around and do some stuff. If really all I'm recording, and I don't have a form for it in the field, but I happen to have an iPad or a smartphone, like an iPhone, I can just, if it's just really quick stuff I need to do, I can really just quickly make that table, make the form, no formatting required, bam, I'm done. And it blows it up on the screen so you can see it real nice. It's not really tiny form. It's actually really well done and really well thought out. So other than that, it's really just a spreadsheet. All the things you can expect to do with a spreadsheet, formulas, whatever. And it's actually got data to tell you how to use the formulas and things like that now. So if you're not familiar with all the little code they use in formulas, it'll help out with that a little bit. And then another thing I like that Numbers does is the formatting of the basic workspace to begin with. Excel and Google, by the way, one thing I hate that they do is the minute you open up a new spreadsheet, it creates an infinite series of columns and rows. Like it's almost just like hurts my brain just to look at it.
Google, you can actually delete them. Because
you can.
We use Google Docs, Google Spreadsheets rather,
right
here at work all the time. And anytime somebody else makes a spreadsheet, I go delete all the extraneous columns and rows because it breaks my brain. I hate this thing that goes out to infinity.
Right? Yeah. And when I'm using like Excel or something like that, and I accidentally, I'm scrolling with a trackpad or something, and I accidentally scroll, I'm like down 1,000 rows before I realize what the hell just happened. I'm like, my God, where did these rows even come from? And yeah, you're right. I can't stand that. And that's one of the things I love about Numbers is when you start a new table, it starts with the default number of rows and columns, but it's something like 20, it's not 20 million. And you can instantly change those really fast. You can add more things. And if I add, like the document that I created actually has a bunch of tables on the screen and some charts that are created from the data in those tables. And I wanted to see all of it at once and organize it in a way that was appealing to me, that I could see. And it's so super simple and easy to do. Again, heavy lifting should probably be done in Excel. Really, really heavy lifting should be done in Excel. But I'm a big fan of using the right tool for the right job, and I love to have a lot of tools in my toolbox. And too many people, especially in archaeology, probably because they don't have the time and energy to really research another option, which I appreciate, and that's why this podcast exists. But if you've got 3 spreadsheets that are available to you between Google, Excel, and Numbers for Apple, they all have their uses. If I want heavy collaboration, I'm going to use Google if I need to collaborate with other people. If I want a really high, powerful spreadsheet with some really complicated formulas and actions going on, I'm going to use Excel. If I want something that doesn't really need a lot of collaboration or just collaboration with other iOS users, doesn't need to do the heavy lifting, but needs to be instantly visually pleasing and is easy to use, then I'm going to use Numbers. And I have no problem switching between all 3 based on need. So
yeah, Numbers really meets that 80-20 rule, where
yeah, it does.
20% of the user or 80% of the users use only 20% of the features.
Yep.
So they seemed really to have focused in on those 20% and streamlined their workflows for that. We actually use it here at school for teaching graphing to middle school kids. Because it's really good for that. And certainly Excel is good for that. And we can do it with Google Spreadsheets, and we can do it with LibreOffice and whatever else. But, the right tool for the job, and simple is definitely a good thing when you're trying to teach middle school kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's important to teach kids like that they don't have to pigeonhole themselves into one tool, into one thing. I mean, you can create tables and graphs of that tabular data in Word too, but who the hell's going to do that? You know what I mean? I mean, I've done it before for simple things.
Don't get me started, because I've seen plenty of people do that.
You do, and there's no reason for it, because you can you can share stuff between Excel and Word just like you can with Numbers and Pages and Google Docs and Google Sheets, and it's You think of that as an example. If you've ever tried to put something, create a table and make data in Word, you know exactly what we're talking about. You really should use something else. So, all right, well, that's all I've got, and it really surprised me that I was going to use that as the app of the day, because I actually had another app planned, but after just using Numbers for the weekend, again, after not using it for a while, I really appreciated the improvements they've made. Also, you can't really beat the price. I want to say it's if it's not free, it's only it's less than $10 for iOS, but I think it might actually be free. I didn't look that up because it won't tell me the price since I already own it. But I know for a fact that if it didn't come on your Mac for some reason, because I think a lot of them come with that suite of programs, that I'm pretty sure is $9.99, and you really can't beat that because, like Paul said, the 80-20 rule, it'll work for it'll work for most of the things you need to do. So that's what I've got. Paul, what do you got today?
Okay, well, I'm glad that you mentioned Word and misuses of Word. So let me ask you a quick question. Do you use a text editor for any of your work?
I used to use, no, not really. Not right now. Yeah.
I use text editors all the time. I mean, I take notes in them. I use them for programming, obviously. So for anybody that doesn't necessarily know what a text editor is, it's a very simple in concept program just for writing down text. Mostly it's used by programmers, and there are a whole suite of different ones that have been around for a long time. The one that I'm currently using is Microsoft Visual Studio Code. There's a class of text editors that's come out for the last 10 years or so. It was TextMate, Sublime Text, Atom, and Code is probably the current front runner, though Atom is very popular as well. And they were really streamlined for web developers, but then they expanded into other kinds of programming as well. And so I've been using Visual Studio Code again, preferentially. They all come with a lot of different plugins, so you can add syntax highlighting for certain programming languages. You can have them display your CSV files as tabular data. You can they integrate with different version control systems like Git. They're not as fully featured as IDEs, the integrated development environments. So they're not like if you're familiar with Xcode or Visual Studio. They're not that. They're just the part that you write the text in, but then with other features that make it really handy to manipulate text. You can select a column of characters, for example, or do powerful searches across your data, across your text rather, using regular expressions. So you can, if you're looking for numbers formatted in a certain way, for example, you can capture all of them and reformat them in a different way through just a couple little commands in the find and replace box. Visual Studio Code, again, it's free. It's from Microsoft. It comes in Mac, Linux, and Windows compatible versions. So whatever platform you're using as your current desktop, I don't believe there's anything that's for mobile. I'm not sure about Android. There's definitely nothing, no Visual Studio Code for iOS. But it's really powerful tool for just getting around lots and lots of text, and it's useful too for structured data. So we talk about data a lot. I can use it for text, for writing down notes. But if I get a data dump out of one of my databases and I want to import it then into Excel, I can run it through a text editor and do certain kinds of cleanups that I might need to do before Excel will accept it nicely. So text editors in general, Visual Studio Code in particular for me right now, really formed kind of the nexus of a lot of the work that I do daily here at the school. But they've, again, I've been using them for years, well before I ever started working here at the school, and well before I had to deal with or even had a very good sense of what structured data was, just because of the simplicity of them.
I used to use, because when you said text editor, I was actually thinking something else entirely. I used to use, this is a few years ago when I was learning HTML5 and JavaScript, I used Text Wrangler. And I actually didn't even consider using that for anything but writing that code in. I hadn't considered using it for other uses, but it was probably way more powerful than I was using it for.
Yeah, no, it's Text Wrangler is another one of the same class. It's got a different pedigree than the TextMate, Sublime Text, Atom Code, in that it's kind of a light version of BB Edit, which has been around for at least 25 years and used to be the major programming text editor for the Mac platform. Okay. And Text Wranglers are free. They're free light version of BB Edit, essentially. But yeah, again, they're so useful for me as an entire class of software that I end up using it all over the place. I mean, part of it is that I did my dissertation, I wrote it in LaTeX, and I wrote it in a text editor. So it gets away from where I contrasted it with Word. Word and the like, word processors are about formatting a document, and text editors are about the content of whatever it is you're working on, be it a document, be it a program, be it a table of data. So they have tools that are specialized for dealing with text in a very different way than a word processor is.
Nice. Well, I think especially with you on the show now, Paul, because you have a definitely an interesting coding, which I love, because we need to get into more of that, as we mentioned in the last episode, for archaeologists, because a lot of things we want to do are so specialized, or at least we think they are. We need to do some research and find out. Somebody's probably already done it. But that being said, a lot of things we do are specialized in our workflows, and we can help make those more efficient by just understanding coding and different things, and just make your own app real quick. You don't need to put it on the App Store. Make your own app and use it to do whatever you want it to do, things like that. So in the spirit of that, and you mentioning text editors, it made me, I just went to the App Store on my iPad here, and I downloaded Swift Playgrounds from Apple, which I've been intending to download and play with. And Swift is the kind of new programming language that Apple is using for their apps. And they put out this free app that's basically, I mean, it's designed for kids. It's designed to show you, here, if you use these commands, you can get these characters to do these different things. But it's a really simple way to learn some powerful things about coding. And I'm going to play around with this and maybe review it for our next episode and see,
Excellent.
see what I think. Yeah. As somebody who doesn't, I don't really know. I know enough about coding just to be dangerous. I don't know enough to actually create or do anything. So I think this will be a good introduction for somebody that's sort of aware of coding and how to do it, but I really don't know what's going on. So I think it'd be good for other people to try out too. And it's free if you have an iPad. I don't think it works on iPhone because they want the bigger screen. But if you happen to have an iPad, it's free to download, and feel free to play with it. And we'll ask you to give your impressions of it. And maybe if you send those into me or into the show, we can give your feedback on that too, if you got to play with it between now and whenever we record the next episode, which will probably be about 2 weeks from now. So, okay. Well, that's all I've got. Anything else on text editing or anything like that?
Oh, I'm sure I've got a million things on text editing, but
not for this
I'm going
episode.
to bore the hell out of all the audience if I keep on rambling on about them.
Right.
But
right.
no, seriously, if for anybody that's working with them, if you're trying to deal with Notepad or text edit on your Windows or your Mac machine, take a look at some of these text editors. Take a look at Visual Studio Code would be my recommendation right now,
right?
Because you might find that it opens up great new ways to improve your workflow.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's all I've got for this week. Paul, thank you. Thanks for the conversation about tech without internet, and thanks for your app suggestions.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for putting up with the fire alarm.
Yeah. Luckily, the listeners didn't have to hear about that. I could just watch the little level meter going up in here as I was hearing it in my headphones. So, all right. Well, thanks, everybody, and we'll be back next week with some more tech for archaeology. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thanks, bye.
That's it for another episode of the Archaeotech Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeotech. If you like the show and want to comment, please do. You can leave comments about this or any other episode on the website or on the iTunes page for this episode. You can also email us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or use the contact form on the podcast webpage. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website or tweet your questions with the hashtag Archaeotech or tag @ArchPodNet in your tweet. Please share the link to this show wherever you saw it. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes or on Stitcher Radio. You can also type the name of the podcast into your favorite podcasting app and subscribe that way. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and leave a review of the show. It helps us get noticed so more people can find our podcast and benefit from the content. Also, send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.